It all started with a letter, not the kind that comes with good news or friendly greetings. This one was printed on stiff white paper, embossed with the seal of the Crescent Pines Homeowners Association. The kind of letter that never brings anything but problems. The moment I saw it taped to my front door, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. I already knew it couldn't be good. The HOA didn't usually communicate with residents unless they were issuing a warning, a violation, or a fine. And sure enough, when I opened it, the words hit me like a punch. You are hereby notified that your animal, a German Shepherd named Duke, is in violation of Section 4.7b of the Crescent Pines Pet Policy. Immediate removal is required within 14 days. For a few seconds, I just stared at the paper, reading and rereading it as if the words might change. But they didn't. According to the HOA, Duke, my best friend, my companion of 6 years, was not welcome in the neighborhood anymore. The reason, buried deep in the legal jargon, was simple: aggressive breed classification. That was it. No incident, no complaint, no proof of danger, just a label, a broad, discriminatory rule against certain breeds that they claimed were unsuitable for a family-friendly community. It didn't matter that Duke had never bitten, barked at, or even growled at anyone. It didn't matter that he was well, trained, licensed, vaccinated, and friendlier than half the people in the neighborhood. The HOA had decided that his breed was enough to make him a problem, and now they were demanding that I get rid of him. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself that HO letters were sometimes just scare tactics, that maybe this was a misunderstanding. But deep down I knew it wasn't. This had Karen written all over it. Every neighborhood has one. That one resident who treats the HOA like a personal kingdom. In Crescent Pines, that person was Margaret Holloway, though most of us just called her Karen behind her back. She was the HOA president, self-appointed enforcer of every rule, and self-proclaimed guardian of community standards. For months, she had complained about Duke. She never came to me directly, of course. She preferred to whisper at board meetings or make snide comments to other residents. She'd glare when I walked Duke down the street, clutching her tiny Pomeranian like it might faint from the mere sight of him. I'd heard through the grapevine that she'd been pushing for no large breed amendment for a while, and apparently, she'd finally gotten it passed during one of those quiet weekday meetings most people didn't know about. And now Duke and I were paying the price. I spent that night unable to sleep. Duke lay beside me, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert, sensing something was wrong. He was my family, had been ever since I adopted him from a rescue shelter 6 years ago after losing my job and moving here for a fresh start. Through everything, long nights, struggles, rebuilding, he'd been my constant companion. I wasn't about to let anyone take him away. The next morning, I drove to the HOA office. The place was exactly what you'd expect. Beige walls, artificial plants, and a front desk stacked with rule books. The receptionist barely looked up when I entered, just pointed me toward the complaint submission forms, as if I were another problem to process. I filed a formal appeal, citing state laws about pet ownership and discrimination against certain breeds. I even included Duke's behavior certification from Obedience School. It was all neat, polite, and professional. Then I waited. Days passed, then weeks, each one filled with anxiety and tension. Every time Duke barked, even once, I felt eyes on me from behind curtains. Karen's eyes, always watching. A second letter arrived 2 weeks later. This one wasn't just a notice, it was a final warning. The HOA board had reviewed my appeal and upheld the decision. I had 7 days to comply or face daily fines and possible legal action. That's when I realized this wasn't about Duke. This was about control, about Karen's need to enforce her will on everyone. But I wasn't the type to back down. Instead of giving in, I decided to dig deeper. I started attending OA meetings, something I'd never done before. The first one was held in the community clubhouse, with Karen sitting at the head of a long table, flanked by her loyal board members. She greeted everyone with that tight, self-satisfied smile of hers, the kind that looked like it was hiding a smirk. The meeting dragged on with talk of landscaping budgets and mailbox paint colors, but I was just waiting for the open floor session. When it came, I calmly raised my hand and asked about the new pet rule. Karen's smile faltered. She didn't expect anyone to challenge her. She quoted bylaws and cited safety concerns, but couldn't name a single incident involving Duke or any other large dog in the neighborhood. When I pressed further, She got defensive, insisting it was for the good of the community. I left that meeting furious, but not defeated. That night, I went online and began researching. I found stories of other homeowners who had fought back against unfair HOA rules, and won. I learned about laws in our state that protected pet owners from breed-based discrimination unless there was a documented safety issue. And I found something else, evidence that Karen had been bending rules for her own benefit. Small things at first, using HOA funds for maintenance that benefited her property, ignoring violations from friends on the board, approving modifications for her own house without the required vote. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that HOA wasn't just unfair, it was rotten. By the end of the week, I had a plan. If they wanted to make an example of me, I'd make an example of them. It wouldn't happen overnight, but one thing was certain: they'd regret ever coming after my dog. And it all started with one simple goal: exposing the truth. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching Duke play in the yard, I knew this fight wasn't just for him anymore. It was for every homeowner who'd ever been bullied by people like Karen, hiding behind rules and authority. The war had begun quietly, but it would end with a roar. The following week marked the beginning of a quiet rebellion. On the surface, everything in Crescent Pines looked the same: trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, pastel-painted homes lined in perfect symmetry. But beneath that manicured calm, a storm was building. I had decided that if I was going to save Duke, I needed to do more than fight letters and argue at meetings. I needed to pull the curtain back on what was really going on behind the HOA's closed doors. So I started where all good investigations begin, with paperwork. The HOA's records were public to homeowners, but most people didn't bother asking for them. They were tedious, hidden behind polite bureaucracy, and buried in binders stacked high with meeting minutes, maintenance reports, and budgets. When I made my request, the receptionist gave me a look like I'd asked for state secrets. But legally, she couldn't refuse. I spent hours combing through those documents. The pages smelled faintly of dust and cheap toner, filled with tables, line items, and official stamps. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary: landscaping expenses, utility costs, committee meeting notes. But the deeper I read, the stranger it became. Small discrepancies stood out: missing receipts, repeated vendor payments, and maintenance contracts awarded to the same company again and again. Holloway Landscaping Services. Karen's last name. I checked business records online. Sure enough, the company was registered under her husband's name. That meant the HOA president had been funneling association funds directly into her own household for years, quietly approving invoices to her husband's business for community beautification projects. That often never happened. That discovery alone was enough to cause a scandal. But I wasn't done. As I went through past meeting minutes, I noticed a pattern. New rules were often passed in meetings with suspiciously low attendance. Most homeowners weren't even notified until after the votes were done. That's how the aggressive breed ban had slipped through. In a session that was scheduled mid-morning on a weekday, when nearly everyone was at work, it was manipulation disguised as governance. I made copies of everything: every invoice, every irregular payment, every questionable vote. My small home office soon looked like a detective's wall, covered in pinned papers, highlighter marks, and arrows connecting names and dates. Still, I knew documentation alone wouldn't be enough. Karen was skilled at spinning narratives, and her supporters on the board would protect her at all costs. I needed more: witnesses, allies, and proof the community could see with their own eyes. So, I started talking. It began casually, small conversations with neighbors during evening walks or at the mailbox. I mentioned the new dog rule, how arbitrary it felt, and how others might be next. I learned I wasn't alone. One neighbor had been fined for leaving a single holiday wreath up too long. Another had been warned about their non-conforming flower garden because it had too many colors. Someone else had paid a fine for parking their truck in their own driveway overnight. Each story painted the same picture. Karen's HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. It was controlling it. People were afraid to speak up, worried about retaliation. But once they realized someone was standing up to the board, they began sharing their frustrations, their letters, and even their copies of fines and violation notices. By the end of that week, I had built a network, an unofficial coalition of fed-up homeowners. Together, we began digging deeper. One neighbor, a retired accountant named Mark, volunteered to help review the OA's financials. Within a few hours, he found more suspicious transactions, duplicate charges, unapproved expenses, and maintenance. Work billed to properties that didn't even need it. Another neighbor, who worked in IT, helped me trace online HOA postings and found evidence of vote tampering on the association's digital ballot system. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed a disturbing image: corruption, manipulation, and abuse of power, all orchestrated by one woman and her inner circle. But uncovering the truth was only half the battle. The other half was exposure. Karen was skilled at maintaining appearances. She presented herself as the perfect neighbor, always polite, always smiling, always looking out for the community. But behind closed doors, she wielded the HOA's power like a weapon. To beat her, I couldn't just present my findings quietly. I had to make sure everyone saw them. So, I waited for the next HOA general meeting, the one held once a quarter, where most of the neighborhood actually showed up. In the days leading up to it, tension filled the air. Karen must have sensed something, because she sent out a newsletter reminding everyone about civility and warning against baseless rumors. She was tightening her grip, afraid of losing control. Meanwhile, Duke stayed by my side through everything. He seemed to know something was different, that the usual calm routine had been replaced with stress and purpose. Every evening, as I reviewed documents or took calls from neighbors, he'd rest his head on my leg, as if silently saying, "Keep going." And I did. The night of the meeting arrived. The clubhouse was packed, more residents than I'd ever seen before. The air was thick with quiet resentment and curiosity. Karen sat at the front as usual, gavel in hand, her pastel suit perfectly pressed. She smiled that practiced, sugary smile and called the meeting to order. For the first hour, it was business as usual. Landscaping updates, budget votes, maintenance schedules. But everyone was waiting for the open forum session, and when it came, I stood. The moment I began speaking, the room shifted. People leaned forward, whispering, listening. I laid out everything: the fake invoices, the conflict of interest, the manipulated votes. Every word was backed by copies of documents I handed to the homeowners themselves. Karen tried to interrupt, tried to dismiss it all as misinterpretation. But the tide had turned. The crowd wasn't buying it. For the first time, she wasn't in control. By the time the meeting ended, whispers had turned into full-blown outrage. People were demanding accountability, audits, and emergency votes. The board members exchanged nervous glances, and Karen's once perfect smile had hardened into a grim mask. I walked out of that room knowing the balance had shifted. The HOA had tried to take my dog. Now, they were fighting to keep their own power. And as for Karen, she wasn't done yet. I could see it in her eyes that night, cold and calculating. She would come after me harder than ever. But this time I was ready. The fallout from the last HOA meeting spread through Crescent Pines like wildfire. For years, the homeowners had quietly tolerated the petty fines, arbitrary rules, and smug authority of Karen Holloway's board. But after that night, things were different. The whispers at mailboxes became open conversations. The small complaints became loud demands. And in the center of it all was me. I hadn't planned to become the face of rebellion, but once the truth came out, there was no going back. The documents I'd presented, the invoices, the conflicts of interest, the altered votes, had shaken the community's trust in the HOA. People who'd once been afraid to speak now sent me messages, offering stories, evidence, or just quiet thanks. But with every homeowner I gained as an ally, I gained one more enemy in Karen. She wasn't used to losing control, and she wasn't about to let me ruin the little empire she'd built. It began subtly at first. Small, almost invisible acts of retaliation. One morning I woke to find a bright orange violation notice taped to my mailbox. According to the letter, my lawn was overgrown and non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. My lawn, which I'd mowed just 2 days earlier. The next week, I received another notice, this time for a non-approved vehicle modification. They were referring to Duke's dog decal on my car's rear window, claiming it violated visual uniformity. Each notice came with a fine, small amounts but enough to be annoying. It was harassment wrapped in paperwork. But Karen didn't stop there. Neighbors I'd spoken to began getting letters too, suddenly fined for trivial things they'd been doing for years. A decorative flag, a slightly faded paint color, a trash can left out 5 minutes past collection time. It was clear Karen was trying to divide and intimidate us. The more she pushed, though, the more people saw through it. Instead of isolating me, she was uniting the neighborhood. Still, the pressure mounted. By the end of the month, I'd racked up hundreds of dollars in supposed violations. The HOA even sent a warning that unpaid fines could lead to a lion on my property. The threat was serious. If they succeeded, they could legally force a foreclosure. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just trying to punish me. She wanted me gone. But fear had long since turned into resolve. I started documenting everything. Photos of my yard, timestamps of my compliance, and every piece of correspondence from the HOA. My folder grew thicker by the day. I was building a defense, and more importantly, a counterattack. Meanwhile, the homeowner's anger continued to simmer. The board tried to issue new rules, restrictions on signs, limits on gatherings, but fewer and fewer residents followed them. The HOA's authority was cracking, and Karen's grip was slipping. So she changed tactics. A week later, Duke and I were walking through the neighborhood when I noticed a black SUV slowly trailing behind us. It wasn't subtle. Every turn I made, it followed. Every stop, it idled a few houses away. When I finally went home, it parked for a few minutes near my driveway before driving off. I knew immediately who was behind it. Karen had friends, people on the board who'd do anything for her, or worse, the private security firm she sometimes hired under, community safety initiatives. They were watching me, hoping to catch Duke doing something they could twist into justification for removing him. It didn't work. Duke was calm, disciplined, and obedient. But the idea that my every move was being watched made me furious. And then, one night, it escalated. I woke up to Duke barking, deep, sharp barks that shook the walls. When I looked outside, I saw at my fence gate wide open and Duke's water bowl tipped over. Someone had been in my yard. I ran outside, heart pounding, flashlight in hand. There was no one there, but the gate latch had been deliberately broken, pried open with something metal. It wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to let Duke out, hoping he'd run loose so they could claim he was dangerous. That was the moment I decided enough was enough. The next morning, I went straight to the county office. I filed an official complaint against the HOA for harassment, fraudulent fines, and violation of homeowner rights. I included every document, every timestamp, every image. At the same time, our growing group of residents filed a petition for a full audit of the HOA's finances. By law, the board was required to comply. Once that happened, the truth would no longer be contained within Crescent Pines. It would be public record. Karen must have realized what was coming because, for the first time, she made a mistake. She showed up at my house. I'll never forget that afternoon. Her pastel cardigan, her tight smile stretched thin, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. She stood at the edge of my driveway, pretending to be civil, but her voice carried the sharp edge of desperation. She told me I was creating unrest, and that the board would not tolerate insubordination. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I simply closed my door. That night, another letter arrived, a notice of hearing. According to the HOA, I was to appear before the board for a disciplinary review regarding continued noncompliance and harassment of HOA officials. They were trying to frame me, to make me the villain. But I wasn't afraid. I knew something Karen didn't. The audit had already been approved. The county was sending an investigator to review the HOA's finances within 2 weeks. For once, the rules were on my side. Over the following days, Crescent Pines became a battleground. Karen tried to rally her loyalists, holding community meetings, to spin her narrative. But it was too late. The truth had spread too far. Residents began organizing on their own, holding informal gatherings, sharing screenshots, recording interactions. Every lie Karen told was countered with proof. Every attempt to intimidate was met with collective resistance. I watched as the neighborhood slowly transformed. The same people who once feared speaking up were now openly questioning every decision, every fee, every rule. The board's facade of control was crumbling. And through it all, Duke remained at my side, calm, loyal, unwavering. The dog they'd called a danger had become a symbol of defiance. By the time the audit date arrived, the community was ready. Karen, however, was not. She had no idea that everything she'd built, her authority, her image, her power, was about to collapse in front of everyone. And when it did, it wouldn't just save Duke. It would end her reign for good. The day of the audit dawned bright and calm, the kind of deceptively peaceful morning that hides a brewing storm. Crescent Pines looked as pristine as ever. The lawns were trimmed, the hedges neat, and the pastel houses glowed under the soft sun. But beneath that perfect surface, tension pulsed through the neighborhood like electricity. Everyone knew this wasn't just another HOA formality. This was the reckoning. The county auditor arrived shortly after 9, a quiet, serious man in a gray suit who didn't waste time on pleasantries. He carried a briefcase full of forms and a calm authority that seemed to unsettle Karen instantly. She greeted him at the HOA office with her practiced smile, her tone dripping with forced politeness. But her eyes told another story. They flickered with unease. I stood across the room, along with several other homeowners who had signed the petition. We weren't part of the audit team, but the county had allowed us to attend as observers. It was the first time any of us had seen the HOA office so full. Normally, it was a quiet, empty space. Now it buzzed with low whispers, shifting feet, and nervous energy. The auditor began by requesting the OA's financial statements, vendor contracts, and meeting minutes for the last 5 years. Karen hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, but enough for everyone to notice. Her assistant, clearly flustered, brought out a series of binders and USB drives. The auditor opened the first binder and began flipping through the pages, jotting notes with a precision that made even the air feel heavy. At first, everything appeared routine, but as the minutes turned into hours, the cracks began to show. It started with duplicate invoices. 2, sometimes 3 identical payments made to HOA landscaping services for the same work. Mowing schedules, seasonal decorations, irrigation maintenance. Each invoice signed off by Karen herself. The auditor raised an eyebrow and asked for corresponding work orders and receipts. Karen stammered something about clerical errors and vendor confusion. But as he dug deeper, those errors multiplied. Thousands of dollars in repetitive payments, all to the same business conveniently owned by her husband. Then came the maintenance contracts, inflated costs for minor projects, approvals without a vote, and even emergency landscaping services, charged during months when there hadn't been a single weather event. Every page told the same story. Money funneled quietly into private pockets under the guise of community upkeep. The homeowners' whispers grew louder. People exchanged glances, shaking their heads. For years, they'd paid their HOA dues faithfully, assuming those funds went toward the neighborhood's upkeep. Now, they were realizing most of it had lined Karen's own wallet. By midday, the evidence of misuse was undeniable. But it wasn't just about money. The auditor found inconsistencies in the voting records. 2 suspicious patterns where online ballots appeared to have been submitted from the same IP address, all favoring Karen's proposals. In one instance, several homeowners' votes had been changed without their knowledge. The room grew tense as the auditor quietly marked another page. Karen's hands trembled slightly as she fidgeted with her pen. Her once commanding posture had shrunk. Her voice, when she tried to interject, came out brittle and uncertain. The final blow came when the auditor requested a review of violation notices, the fines issued to homeowners. He noticed that certain addresses received multiple warnings for trivial issues, while others, notably those belonging to board members and Karen's close friends, had none at all. Even when clear violations were documented in photos, it was targeted enforcement, harassment disguised as policy. By the time the audit concluded that evening, the evidence spoke for itself. The HOA's financial practices were riddled with fraud, conflict of interest, and procedural abuse. The auditor announced that an official report would be filed with the county for further investigation. The board's activities would be suspended pending review. Karen sat frozen behind her desk, her smile gone completely. For years, she had ruled this neighborhood with a pastel fist, issuing fines, banning pets, and enforcing every arbitrary rule with smug precision. Now she looked small, exposed. As we all filed out, there was no gloating, just a quiet, collective exhale. It wasn't triumph yet, but it was justice beginning to take shape. That night, the neighborhood felt different. People stood outside chatting freely for the first time in months. Someone even organized an impromptu cookout in their driveway. No forms, no approvals, no permission. For once, the HOA wasn't watching. But even as the community celebrated, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. People like Karen didn't go down quietly. And sure enough, the next morning, I woke up to a new letter. This one slid under my door, not delivered through the usual channels. No letterhead, no signature, just a single line typed across the center of the page. You don't know what you've started. It wasn't from the HOA. It was personal. I kept the note, adding it to my growing collection of evidence. The audit had crippled Karen's authority, but it hadn't erased her influence entirely. There were still people loyal to her, people who benefited from her rule, or simply feared her enough to do her bidding, and they weren't going to let this go quietly. In the following days, the HOA office was locked, and county investigators began collecting records. Karen, stripped of her power, retreated behind closed doors, but the damage was done. The entire community now knew the truth. The whispers that had once been cautious had turned into outrage. Homeowners demanded a vote to remove the entire board and hold new elections. Petitions circulated faster than ever. What had started as one man trying to protect his dog had become a full-blown neighborhood revolution. For the first time since moving into Crescent Pines, I felt proud to live there. The facades of perfection were gone, replaced by genuine community. Neighbors helping neighbors, standing together instead of hiding behind their fences. But beneath that hope was an undercurrent of tension. There were strange cars parked on the street at night. Lights flickering in the HOA office long after it was supposed to be empty. It was as if someone was still trying to erase the evidence, to undo what we'd exposed. And when I came home one evening to find my front gate wide open again, Duke standing guard at the door, growling at the shadows, I knew this wasn't finished. Karen was desperate, cornered, and dangerous. The HOA might have fallen, but the fight wasn't over yet. The week after the audit felt like the eye of a storm, unnervingly calm, almost peaceful, yet charged with invisible tension. The HOA board was suspended, Karen had vanished from sight, and Crescent Pines was under temporary county supervision. For the first time in years, there were no warning letters in mailboxes, no fines slipped under doors, and no cold stares from the HOA patrol during morning walks. But peace in a neighborhood like this was never permanent. Karen's absence was a silence that screamed. Her house, once meticulously perfect, now looked neglected. Blinds drawn, mailbox overflowing, the front lawn losing its manicured shape. Some neighbors claimed they'd seen her pacing late at night through the windows, light flickering in a single room. Others swore they saw unfamiliar cars coming and going, their engines idling in the dark. It would have been easy to think she was gone for good. But I knew better. People like Karen didn't fade quietly. They plotted. And the first sign came 3 nights later. It was around midnight when Duke started barking, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the house. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and saw tire tracks cutting across my front lawn. The garden lights were smashed, and the fence that once kept Duke safe stood half collapsed. Whoever had done it knew exactly where to hit, the place that mattered most. The message was clear. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a warning. I spent the next morning repairing the fence, but word spread fast. By noon, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, helping me replant the garden and clean up. For the first time, it wasn't about HOA rules or appearances. It was about solidarity. Each hammer strike, each nail driven into place, was an act of quiet defiance. But while the community was coming together, the cracks beneath the surface were deepening. That evening, an anonymous post appeared on the neighborhood forum. It accused me of fabricating the audit, of planting fake evidence, of being the reason HOA funds were frozen. As if I were the villain who'd ruined the community. The post was full of lies, but what stood out was its tone, polished, precise, and personal. It was Karen's writing style. She was back, and this time, she was fighting dirty. Within hours, rumors spread. Some homeowners still loyal to her began questioning the audit's legitimacy. Others grew fearful, wondering what would happen to their property values with all this bad publicity. The same division Karen had used to control people before was taking root again, spreading like a virus. And then came the petition, not the one we'd started, but hers. A demand to reinstate the old HOA board, claiming the audit was inconclusive and politically motivated. She'd somehow rallied a dozen signatures overnight. When the county officials returned to investigate the vandalism and monitor ongoing complaints, they found a community teetering between justice and chaos. Karen's strategy was clear. If she couldn't control the HOA, she'd burn its reputation down with her. Days later, the situation reached its breaking point. A community meeting was called, a final hearing to discuss the future of Crescent Pines. The county representative, a calm but firm woman named Ms. Green, presided over it. The hall was packed. More people than I'd ever seen attend anything HOA related. There was tension in the air so thick you could feel it pressing down on your chest. Karen arrived late, as if to make an entrance. She walked in wearing her trademark pastel blazer, her expression calculated, not the tyrant we'd come to know, but the victim she now pretended to be. She took the floor and delivered a speech dripping with false humility, claiming she'd only ever protected community standards, that the audit was a misunderstanding, and that she'd been unfairly targeted by those who didn't respect order. She never said my name, but every eye in the room turned toward me anyway. I stayed silent. I didn't need to say anything. The truth had already been laid bare. And yet, as she spoke, I saw doubt creeping into people's faces. She was manipulative, persuasive, and knew exactly how to twist fear into loyalty. But then Ms. Green spoke, calmly, factually, and with authority. She presented the official audit report, projecting it onto the screen for everyone to see. Line by line, it exposed Karen's deceit, fraudulent transactions, falsified votes, and misuse of community funds. The room fell silent as the evidence rolled out like a slow avalanche, crushing every word Karen had just spoken. Her mask cracked. By the time the report finished, there was no room for doubt. The community erupted. Some shouted, others demanded refunds, and a few simply sat in disbelief. Karen tried to defend herself, but her voice was drowned out by the noise. Security had to escort her out before things turned violent. When she passed me on her way out, she didn't speak. She just glared. A glare sharp enough to cut through the noise. It wasn't anger anymore. It was pure hatred. In that moment, I realized something chilling. I hadn't just defeated her authority. I'd humiliated her. And that kind of wound didn't heal. Over the next few days, the fallout was immense. Karen was officially removed from her position. County charges were filed for embezzlement and fraudulent conduct. The HOA was dissolved temporarily while a new, transparent board was formed. Crescent Pines, for the first time in years, was free. But freedom came with scars. The community had been through war, and though Karen was gone, her shadow lingered. Some neighbors still locked their doors early, others installed cameras, and many just avoided talking about what had happened. As for me, I rebuilt what she'd tried to destroy. My fence, my peace, and my trust in my neighbors. Duke, once the symbol of defiance, now roamed freely again, loved by everyone. The same dog Karen had tried to ban had become the heartbeat of Crescent Pines. But just when I thought it was over, a new rumor began to spread, one that whispered of Karen's house being put up for sale. Some said she'd fled town, others claimed she was fighting her case in silence. And one evening, as I walked Duke past her darkened windows, I noticed something strange. A faint glow from inside. Not the usual light, but the flicker of a television screen. The blinds shifted slightly. Someone was still there. I couldn't see who, but I knew deep down the story wasn't finished. When the dust finally settled, Crescent Pines looked almost unrecognizable. The air that once carried tension and silent judgment now felt open, light, and alive. The lawns no longer looked like replicas of one another. The houses, once painted in the same dull palette, began to show hints of individuality. Pastel blues, soft greens, even a daring red door or two. For years, the HOA had ruled this neighborhood like a quiet dictatorship, a system built on compliance, fines, and fear. And now, that system had collapsed under the weight of its own hypocrisy. What replaced it wasn't chaos, as Karen had always warned. It was community. People who'd barely spoken before began talking again. Kids played in the streets without someone shouting about noise ordinances. Garden clubs reformed, neighbors shared tools, and the annual barbecue. Once a restricted, rule-laden event, turned into a spontaneous block party that stretched across the entire cul-de-sac. And in the middle of it all was Duke. The same dog who had once been branded a nuisance had become something of a local hero. Children adored him, families stopped by with treats, and even the once stoic retirees who used to complain about barking found themselves smiling when he trotted by. Duke had gone from outlaw to mascot, a living reminder of what we'd all endured and what we'd overcome. But even as life moved forward, I couldn't ignore the lingering unease that came with every quiet night. Karen's house remained unsold. The blinds stayed drawn, the lawn overgrown. Sometimes, a light flickered from within, but there were no signs of life beyond that. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then one morning, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address, just my name scrawled in neat, deliberate handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Inside was a single sheet of paper. a property release form. Karen was formally relinquishing her position as HOA president, effective immediately, and transferring all remaining administrative rights to the county board. At the bottom, a short note. You got what you wanted. Enjoy it while it lasts. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It read more like a warning. A week later, moving trucks arrived in front of her house. The curtains fluttered for the last time, and by evening, she was gone. No one saw her leave. No goodbyes, no explanations. Just silence where her presence used to loom. Crescent Pines breathed again. Over the months that followed, the community voted to form a new HOA, one without the corruption, secrecy, and control that had plagued the old one. This time it was built around fairness, transparency, and volunteerism. Every homeowner had a voice, and every decision was made openly. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They even offered me a position on the new board. The same role Karen had once wielded like a weapon. I didn't accept it right away. Part of me feared becoming what I'd fought against. But another part of me knew that change only lasts if someone's willing to protect it. So eventually, I said yes. Sitting at that first meeting felt surreal. The table was the same, but the energy was different. No more intimidation, no more power plays, just neighbors working together. And when the topic of pet policy came up, everyone laughed. The first official act of the new Crescent Pines Association was to remove the breed ban that had started everything. Duke had one, we all had. Life settled into something resembling normal. The fences stayed painted however their owners liked. The lawns weren't always perfect, but they were real. There was a certain beauty in that imperfection. A reminder that freedom wasn't always tidy, but it was worth fighting for. Still, I sometimes thought about Karen. Rumors surfaced here and there. That she'd moved to another state, that she'd joined another HOA, that she was fighting legal battles over the audit. Some said she was living quietly, others whispered she was plotting her return. But those stories came and went, fading like ghostly echoes of a past none of us wanted to revisit. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I sat on the porch with Duke lying beside me. His fur caught the golden light, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt still. No letters, no threats, no meetings, just the sound of wind moving through the trees. It struck me then how strange it was that something as simple as a dog could unravel an entire empire of control. But maybe that's how all change begins. Not with grand gestures, but with small acts of defiance that remind people of what's right. Months later, during a community celebration, someone brought out an old photo album, pictures from the Karen era. There she was, standing at the front gate with her clipboard, her eyes sharp, her smile thin. Someone laughed, and soon the whole crowd joined in, not in cruelty, but in relief, as if laughter was the final step in letting go. That night, when the fireworks lit up the sky, Duke barked joyfully at each explosion, tail wagging, eyes bright. The whole neighborhood cheered. And as the final spark faded into darkness, I realized something. This wasn't just a story about revenge. It was about reclaiming something deeper, dignity, community, and the right to live without fear. Karen had tried to control us through rules and fear. But in the end, it was the very thing she couldn't understand, kindness, unity, and defiance, that destroyed her grip completely. The HOA tried to ban my dog, but all they really did was unleash a fight they couldn't win. And now, every time I see Duke running freely through the open yards of Crescent Pines, I know one thing for sure. No one will ever silence this neighborhood again.